Las Vegas, early 1970s. Elvis Presley has reclaimed his throne after the '68 comeback special and the triumphant shows at the Hilton. To the world, he is untouchable. The king in glittering white jumpsuits, commanding stages with a single note. Yet, behind the curtain, he feels something else: pressure, exhaustion, a creeping sense of isolation. And then, on a night like any other, everything changes. As the applause still shakes the showroom walls, a stranger slips past the guards and walks straight into Elvis's dressing room. He isn't a fan begging for an autograph. He isn't a promoter with a contract. Without a word, he places a sealed envelope on the table, leans close, and whispers, "This is from someone who believes in you more than you believe in yourself." Inside, a cashier's check for $1 million. But the real shock isn't the money. It's the mystery behind it. Who would dare leave such a gift? What strings might be hidden? And most of all, what will Elvis do with it? That single envelope will ignite a journey more dangerous, more revealing, and more human than any stage he ever stood on. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The Hilton showroom in Las Vegas still trembled with the echo of the last chords. Hours earlier, 3,000 voices had merged into a single roar, an ocean of applause rising toward the stage. The chandeliers overhead glittered like constellations, refracting the blinding stage lights that only minutes ago had drenched every inch of the room. Now the hall was nearly empty, but a faint vibration remained in the walls, as if the building itself had been part of the performance. Backstage, the contrast was brutal. The instant the curtain dropped and the orchestra filed out, the noise of the crowd dissolved into the muffled hush of narrow corridors. The smell of hairspray lingered, mixed with cigar smoke and the metallic tang of sweat from the horn players who had just packed up. Inside Elvis's dressing room, the air felt heavy. A single fan buzzed in the corner, blowing lukewarm air across a vanity littered with water glasses, eyeliner pencils, and a pair of gold-rimmed sunglasses. Elvis sat slouched on a chair, the sequins of his jumpsuit catching dull reflections from the mirror. His hair, damp with sweat, clung to his forehead. He had given everything out there. His voice rasped slightly even when he chuckled, thanking a backing singer for a towel. Yet despite the exhaustion, his eyes still carried that strange glint, a mix of defiance, fatigue, and a trace of boyish wonder that never quite left him. The room was guarded by two of his men. Red West leaned against the door frame, arms folded, scanning every corridor noise like a watchdog. Sonny West sat on a low couch, loosening his tie, puffing on a cigar that gave the whole room its sharp, bitter scent. Near the mirror stood Colonel Tom Parker, his Panama hat balanced neatly on a side table. He was already calculating tomorrow's schedule, scribbling notes, chewing gum furiously, oblivious to the hush that had settled over Elvis himself. It was at that moment the door opened. Red jerked upright, ready to snap at whoever dared intrude. But the man who entered wasn't staff, nor a fan who had slipped past security in a frenzy. He walked in quietly, with a kind of solemn authority. His suit was dark, not flashy, worn with the stiffness of someone who was more used to offices than casinos. He wasn't escorted, and no one announced him. It was as if the guards outside had simply chosen not to see him. For a few seconds, the room froze. Parker's jaw tightened. He wasn't a man who liked surprises. Sonny stubbed out his cigar halfway, his eyes narrowing. Elvis raised his head, but, unlike the others, he didn't bristle. He studied the stranger with mild curiosity, as though the exhaustion had stripped away his instinct to be defensive. The man said nothing. He didn't extend a hand or even offer his name. He simply stepped forward, reached into the inner pocket of his coat, and placed a long white envelope on the cluttered vanity table. His movements were deliberate, calm, without hesitation. The silence that followed felt like it lasted a full minute. Red moved forward, ready to shove the man back out into the hallway, but Elvis raised a hand ever so slightly, just enough to halt him. His expression hadn't changed. He simply watched. "Sir," Parker finally snapped, his voice sharp, "you can't just—" But before he could finish, the stranger turned, walked out as silently as he had entered, and vanished down the hallway. No protest from the outer guards, no one calling after him. The door clicked shut. Sonny exhaled hard, muttering something under his breath. Red swore and yanked the door open, storming into the hallway, but returned seconds later, baffled. "Nobody's there," he said. The envelope sat untouched on the vanity. Parker stared at it like it might be rigged with explosives. "Don't you dare open that," he barked, his accent thickening with irritation. "Could be anything. Could be trouble." Elvis leaned forward slowly. He picked up the envelope, turning it in his hands. It was plain, sealed cleanly, no markings except his name written in a tidy cursive script. Elvis Presley. No address, no return. He tore it open. Inside was a single slip of paper. Not a letter, not a note, just a cashier's check. The figure on it made Parker's gum freeze in his jaw. $1 million. For a moment, no one breathed. The reality of it hung in the air heavier than the cigar smoke. Red let out a low whistle. Sonny muttered, "Lord have mercy," and rubbed his face like he had to be sure he wasn't dreaming. Parker reached forward, but Elvis pulled the check back before his manager's fingers could touch it. The king studied it in silence. His expression betrayed no greed, no rush of triumph. He didn't smile. He simply held the slip of paper as though it were something fragile, a relic dug up from the ground. "Real or not," Parker muttered, trying to regain control. "This stinks." No man walks in off the street with $1 million gift. That's a setup. That's the IRS. That's someone trying to tie you up in court. Don't you see it? But Elvis still didn't answer. He folded the check carefully, slid it back into the envelope, and laid it on the vanity. His hands were steady. Finally, in a low voice that carried more calm than the others could comprehend, he said, "Not everything's a trap, Colonel." The room erupted, Parker snapping about fraud, Red insisting they burn the thing, Sonny warning about reporters finding out. But Elvis sat there quietly, sweat still drying on his temples, the cheers of thousands still ringing faintly in his ears. He had faced temptation in every form, fame, women, power, but this was different. Something about the stranger's silence, his composure, gnawed at him. To everyone else, it was an absurd, dangerous puzzle. To Elvis, it felt almost like a message. He leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the envelope, and whispered to no one in particular, "There's more to this than money." The others didn't hear him. They were too busy arguing. But Elvis knew. The envelope remained on the vanity for days, untouched except when Elvis picked it up at night and stared at it as though it might begin to explain itself. The world around him kept spinning. Shows, rehearsals, endless casino lights. But his attention kept circling back to the slip of paper that could shift a man's life entirely. Colonel Parker would not let it go. His voice, grating and insistent, followed Elvis everywhere. In hotel corridors, inside limousines, even during meals when the king hardly touched his food. "It's bait, son," Parker repeated, his fingers tapping the table like a metronome. "A check that size don't just fall out of the sky. Somebody's looking to snare you. You cash it. You'll find yourself in headlines you'll never get out of. The paranoia was contagious. The bodyguards murmured about blackmail schemes. One of the accountants muttered about tax fraud. A casino executive joked nervously that it could be mafia money. But when Parker finally took the check to be examined, reluctantly, at Elvis's insistence, the results deepened the mystery. The paper was genuine. The issuing bank confirmed its validity, its funds secure, guaranteed by a trust. Yet when Parker demanded to know the name behind it, he hit a wall. The paperwork listed a foundation with no clear owner, no known benefactor, a ghost of an institution. Parker came back red-faced, hat tilted back on his head, sweat shining through his shirt. They won't say, nobody will say. Either someone's covering their tracks, or this whole thing's rotten. He threw the folder down as though it had betrayed him personally. Elvis studied the documents in silence, the same way he had studied the envelope the first night. The king's calmness irritated Parker. Most men would have rushed to cash it, or burned it, or called the police. Elvis did none of those things. He simply kept asking himself the same question. Why me? Nights grew long in the Hilton suite. The city never slept, but sometimes, around 3 in the morning, even the neon seemed tired. Elvis would slip away from the noise, sit at the grand piano tucked into his suite, and let his fingers wander. Gospel chords, half-finished melodies, fragments of hymns his mother had once sung. He played quietly, as though afraid of waking the walls. Sometimes he muttered under his breath. Not quite prayer, not quite thought. What am I supposed to do with this, Lord? What's the meaning here? The colonel wanted it locked in a safe. The guards wanted it burned. The accountants wanted it traced. But Elvis wanted to understand. 3 days after the concert, a new envelope arrived at the hotel front desk. No one saw who delivered it. The same neat handwriting spelled his name. This time, there was no check inside. Only a slip of heavy paper, the kind that feels expensive even in the dark. The message contained only one line, written with a steady hand. Use this for something that will outlive you. No signature. When Elvis read it aloud, the room fell into stunned quiet. Sonny shifted uncomfortably, his voice low. That don't sound like no blackmail. Red disagreed. Could be reverse psychology. Could be they want you to get tied up in some charity scam. And then, boom, you're finished. Parker only scowled. It's a trick. Somebody's toying with us. But Elvis didn't hear them. The words echoed too strongly inside him. Outlive him. What could possibly outlive the name Elvis Presley? The thought rattled him. Fame, fortune, records sold. He knew deep down none of it lasted. He had seen careers vanish, names erased. What the stranger asked of him cut far deeper than temptation. It was a challenge. That night, he didn't play gospel tunes on the piano. He played slow, pensive chords, staring out at the desert through the hotel window. The city lights stretched endlessly, but beyond them was nothing but darkness, miles of silence. Parker's voice intruded even then. He stormed into the suite, still chewing gum like it might calm his nerves. Listen, son, you don't go near that money till I say so. You don't spend a dime. I'll get investigators. I'll get bankers. I'll tear apart this so-called trust until I know what's behind it. Until then, you keep your hands clean. You hear me? Elvis only pressed down harder on the piano keys, letting a low minor chord roll through the room. Colonel, he said softly, maybe it ain't about hands. Maybe it's about heart. Parker stared at him like he was losing his mind. Heart don't pay the bills, son. Heart don't keep you out of court. But Elvis didn't argue. He just kept playing. Later that same night, alone again, he unfolded the second note. He read it a dozen times until the words began to blur. Use this for something that will outlive you. For a man who had everything money could buy, the idea struck like a hammer. If he followed the message, it meant turning away from indulgence, from the endless stream of cars, planes, and houses. It meant thinking not as a star, but as a mortal man. And that was the part that scared him most. The clock ticked past 4. His voice was barely a whisper as he looked at the ceiling and said, "Why me, Lord? Why now?" No answer came, only the faint hum of the Vegas night outside and the unopened bottle of champagne on the dresser that nobody had touched. The king sat there with the envelope resting beside the piano, its weight larger than the city beyond the glass. Something had begun, and he knew it wasn't just about money. The $1 million check lay hidden inside a locked drawer in Elvis's suite at the Hilton. The colonel insisted on that arrangement, demanding at least a symbolic show of control. Yet every time Elvis passed the dresser, he felt its presence like a pulse beneath the wood. He hadn't touched it in days, but the thought never left him. Money had never been absent from his life since fame arrived. Planes, jewels, Cadillacs, the Graceland estate itself. He had indulged spoiled friends and strangers alike, and burned through fortunes faster than most men could dream of earning. But this wasn't the same. This wasn't his money. It was a gift, or a test, and that made all the difference. He carried the unease with him onto the stage, into the casino restaurants, into sleepless nights. His shows still drew thunderous applause, but somewhere behind the spotlight, his mind lingered on the stranger's words, "Something that will outlive you." In a rare pause between concerts, Elvis arranged a quiet meeting with one of the few people he trusted outside the colonel's orbit, a local pastor he had known for years. They sat in the small office of a modest church on the outskirts of Las Vegas. The wooden walls smelled faintly of old hymnals and wax candles, a sharp contrast to the velvet and neon of the Strip. The pastor, a man with kind eyes and thinning hair, listened carefully as Elvis recounted the story. Not the tabloids, not the exaggerated versions, but the simple truth. A stranger, a check, a message. Elvis's voice dropped low as he confessed his fear that the gift wasn't about money at all. The pastor leaned back, folding his hands. Sometimes the Lord places something in your path not to tempt you, but to remind you. The question is not, what do you want from it? But, what does it want from you? Elvis stared at the floor. The answer rang uncomfortably true. He had lived years chasing the next thrill. And yet, here he was, holding a chance to create something lasting. That evening, back at the Hilton, he opened the drawer again. He held the envelope under the yellow glow of a bedside lamp, studying the check like it was a mirror. With a sigh, he slid it into the pages of his Bible, between the Psalms, and closed the cover. If there was a place safe enough for it, it was there. "I'll wait," he murmured to himself, "until I know." But the waiting didn't bring him peace. Instead, the struggle deepened. A week later, during a performance, Elvis noticed something unusual in the front rows. Amidst the sequins and tuxedos, a family sat in plain clothes, their seats clearly the cheapest in the house. The father's jacket was frayed at the cuffs. The mother held a little girl whose dress was faded but clean, carefully ironed. They clapped timidly, not with the wild abandon of gamblers on vacation, but with awe, as though this one night was the brightest thing they had seen in years. Elvis's voice faltered for a fraction of a second as he caught the little girl's eyes. She clung to her mother, smiling so wide it seemed her whole face glowed. He finished the song, the crowd erupting, but when he bowed, his mind wasn't on the applause. It was on them. Later, back in his dressing room, he asked Red to find out who they were. Word came back that they had scraped together every dollar they had to buy the cheapest tickets, traveling from a small town just for this chance. They couldn't afford the buffet, couldn't stay in the hotel, and planned to sleep in their car before driving home in the morning. The image wouldn't leave him. He had once been that poor boy himself, unable to imagine luxury, grateful for any kindness. And now here was a family, almost a mirror of his past, staring at him as though he held some kind of salvation. He sat alone at the piano long after everyone had gone, the stage empty, the curtains drawn. His fingers found a soft progression, chords filled with longing. He whispered to himself, "Maybe it ain't meant for me at all. Maybe it's theirs." The colonel barged in minutes later, his irritation thinly veiled. "Don't go soft, son. That check stays where it is. You can't save every sad-eyed family out there." Elvis didn't answer. He just kept playing, staring at the keys like they might unlock the decision for him. For the first time since he received the envelope, the path began to take shape in his mind. Not cars, not planes, not another mansion, but something that stretched beyond him. Something for the girl in the front row, for all the faces like hers. That night, sleep refused him. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling fan turning lazily overhead, replaying the pastor's words, the stranger's message, the child's smile. His chest ached not with fear, but with a strange, rising certainty. The gift wasn't for him to keep. It was for him to give. The days rolled on with the same rhythm, sold-out shows, autograph lines, the shuffle of casino staff herding audiences through velvet ropes. Yet beneath the glitter of the Hilton showroom, a quiet storm brewed. Colonel Tom Parker was restless. His authority, usually absolute, had been shaken by that envelope, and the way Elvis kept guarding it like a sacred relic. The colonel called a meeting one afternoon in a private suite. The curtains were drawn tight, despite the desert sun, and the air reeked of his ever-present cigars. Elvis entered slowly, wearing a loose shirt instead of his rhinestone jumpsuit, looking younger, almost weary. Around the table sat Sonny, Red, and a few aides. The colonel stood at the head, hat resting on the chair beside him like a badge of office. "Gentlemen," Parker began, his voice carrying the false warmth of a salesman, "we got a matter to settle. Our boy here's holding on to a check big enough to build another Hilton. And instead of making it work for us, he's playing philosopher. That don't fly." Elvis lowered himself into a chair without answering. He hated these performances, Parker speaking of him as if he weren't in the room. Parker jabbed a finger on the table. "Listen, son. You take that money, we put it into promotion. Billboards coast to coast. We finance a television special that'll crush the competition. You think you're big now? You ain't seen nothing. $1 million turned right could bring 10 more." The room was quiet except for the colonel's chewing gum snapping between his teeth. Elvis finally spoke, his voice low and measured. "What if that ain't the point?" A visible ripple went through the table. Sonny glanced at Red. No one ever contradicted the colonel directly, not in front of others. Parker leaned in, eyes narrowing. "The point, son, is survival. You want to keep your name in lights? You want to keep these boys paid? Then you use every tool you got. That check is a gift from heaven itself, and you'd be a fool not to cash it." Elvis straightened, his jaw tightening. "Feels more like a test than a gift." For a rare second, the colonel faltered. He quickly recovered, but the crack had shown. He puffed on his cigar, then muttered, "Tests don't come with dollar signs that long." Tests come from the IRS. The meeting ended in uneasy silence. Elvis left first, pushing back his chair with a scrape that echoed across the room. The bodyguards avoided his eyes as he walked out. That night, the tension escalated. Parker barged into Elvis's suite after midnight, slamming the door so hard the chandelier rattled. He had spent the evening calling contacts, bankers, casino bosses, even old acquaintances in Nashville, trying to uncover the origin of the trust behind the check. Nothing. No trail, no whisper, no clue. For a man who prided himself on knowing every lever of control, the emptiness rattled him more than he admitted. "You're playing with fire," he hissed, pacing the carpet. "I can't find the man. I can't find the money. It's like it came from nowhere. You want to destroy yourself, son? Go ahead. But don't drag me with you." Elvis stood by the piano, one hand resting on the lid. His face was calm, but his eyes were sharp. "Maybe you can't find him because you're looking in the wrong places. Maybe it ain't about power or business at all." The Colonel slammed his fist against the wall. "Don't get holy on me, Elvis. You're an entertainer, not a preacher. People pay to hear you sing, not save the world." Elvis's reply was quiet, almost tender. "Maybe people need both." The words hung in the room, heavier than shouting. Parker stared at him, chewing hard, unable to form an answer. For the first time, he saw something dangerous in Elvis. Not rebellion for rebellion's sake, but a kind of freedom. The check had cracked something in their arrangement, something Parker could not patch with contracts or threats. The following days, Parker doubled down. He cornered Elvis between rehearsals, weaving financial warnings like traps. "You think generosity keeps the lights on? You think a handshake feeds the payroll?" His voice grew harsher, desperate. But the more he pressed, the more Elvis withdrew into silence, the piano becoming his refuge. One evening, after another grueling show, Elvis sat with Red and Sonny in the suite. They chatted idly, the television buzzing in the background. The Colonel had retreated to his own quarters, nursing his paranoia. Red finally asked, "Boss, you really gonna hang on to that check forever?" Elvis looked at them both, eyes weary but steady. "I ain't hanging on to it for me. I'm holding it 'cause it feels like it's the first thing in years I wasn't meant to spend on myself." The remark silenced them. They'd seen him shower strangers with gifts, buy Cadillacs for fans, pay medical bills for acquaintances. But this sounded different, like he saw himself not as the giver, but as the keeper of something larger. Later that night, alone, he pulled the check from the Bible and stared at it again. The Colonel's grip was tightening, but with each word of protest, Elvis felt a sliver of strength rising in him. For years, Parker had controlled the contracts, the tours, even the movies. But here was something the Colonel couldn't claim. Elvis susurró para sí mismo, casi como un voto. "Esto no es sobre negocios. This is about freedom." The neon of the strip glowed through the window, bright yet hollow. And for the first time in a long while, Elvis felt a step closer to breaking out of the cage he had lived in for years. The tour schedule granted Elvis a brief pause in late summer, a gap between Vegas shows and a run of concerts further south. Instead of retreating into luxury, he chose something quieter. Without fanfare, without cameras, he asked the driver to take him to Memphis, away from the strip's noise, away from the Colonel's endless calculations. One afternoon, dressed simply in a plain jacket and dark glasses, he walked into a children's hospital that had long struggled to stay afloat. He had supported it before, sometimes with quiet donations, sometimes with visits no reporters knew about. The halls smelled of disinfectant and faint medicine, but the place pulsed with a different kind of energy. The stubborn will of children fighting battles their bodies weren't built for. Nurses tried to hide their surprise as Elvis moved from room to room, greeting families as though he were just another visitor. He shook hands, signed casts, sang a few bars of lullabies when a child requested it. No stage, no spotlight, just his voice filling white-painted rooms. In one ward, a boy no older than 10 tugged at his sleeve. His cheeks were pale, but his eyes burned with excitement. "My mama told me once," the boy whispered, "that you bought us groceries when we had nothing. She said you kept us from going hungry. She said there were good people in the world because of you." The words hit harder than any ovation. Elvis crouched beside the bed, at a loss for what to say. He remembered times from his own boyhood when charity bags of food had been the difference between starvation and survival. To hear that someone's memory of him carried the same kind of weight, it cut straight to the heart. He squeezed the boy's hand gently and whispered, "Your mama was right about one thing. There are good people. And don't you forget it." He left the ward quieter than he had entered, the boy's words echoing louder than any song he had sung that year. As he walked toward the exit, something caught his attention. A man lingered at the end of the hallway, too still to be a visitor waiting for someone, too calm to be staff rushing between duties. He wasn't dressed for the place. Dark suit, polished shoes, posture rigid. His gaze never left Elvis. Elvis slowed, almost instinctively. For a second, their eyes met. The man gave no sign of recognition, no smile, no nod, only that unwavering stare. Elvis stepped toward him, but just as quickly, the stranger turned and vanished down a side corridor. Red, trailing behind, asked, "You know him?" Elvis shook his head, unsettled. "Number. But I've seen eyes like that before." The incident left a shadow over the rest of the visit. When he returned to his hotel suite that evening, the unease hadn't faded. And waiting on the table, delivered with no explanation, was another envelope. It was identical to the first two. Clean, plain, his name written in the same controlled script. Hands trembling slightly, he opened it. Inside were not checks this time, but clippings, small, neatly cut squares from old newspapers. One spoke of how Elvis had donated to tornado victims years before. Another recalled his anonymous contribution to a family after a fire destroyed their home. Yet another described gifts of wheelchairs to a local hospital. At the bottom of the pile was a short note, handwritten, "You already know where this money belongs. Don't hesitate." Elvis sat down heavily, the clippings spread before him like fragments of his own past. Each one was a memory he had half forgotten, gestures he never expected recognition for. Yet someone had kept track. Someone had been watching. The colonel stormed in soon after, waving a telegram from a promoter, barking about ticket sales. He saw the clippings and frowned. "Who's feeding you this garbage? More tricks, more bait. They're playing with your head, son." But Elvis barely heard him. His mind wasn't on profits or scams anymore. The boy's trembling voice in the hospital replayed again and again, layered over the silent presence of the hallway stranger. And now these clippings, proof that every act of kindness had rippled further than he ever imagined. That night, he stayed awake at the window, staring over the Memphis skyline. A soft rain misted the streets below. The envelope lay open on the dresser, its contents scattered. He thought about the check locked inside his Bible, about the boy's pale hand clutching his sleeve, about the man disappearing down the corridor. And for the first time, he whispered aloud, "This ain't about me at all. It's about what I leave behind." The rain tapped gently against the glass, as if affirming his words. The decision came quietly, without announcement, late one evening in Memphis. Elvis sat alone at the piano in his suite, the check resting once more on the music stand, its edges worn from being handled so often. The city outside buzzed with restless nightlife, but inside the room all he heard was the soft hum of the air conditioner and the faint vibration of his own heartbeat. He knew the colonel would never approve. He knew the accountants would raise alarms. But something inside him, a force stronger than fear, whispered that waiting any longer was betrayal. The hospital visit, the boy's words, the clippings left in that envelope, they had built a weight too heavy to ignore. The next morning, he called a trusted lawyer in town, a man who had once helped him with private donations in the past. The meeting was discreet, held in a back office above a pharmacy where few would think to look for the king of rock and roll. Elvis wore a cap pulled low, glasses shielding his face. "I want this handled quietly," he said firmly, sliding the check across the desk. "No headlines, no photo ops. Nobody needs to know but the people who need it." The lawyer examined the paper, his eyebrows shooting up. "This is real?" Elvis nodded. "Real enough to change lives. Let's start with the Children's Hospital. They need new equipment. And make sure nobody traces it back to me. I mean it." The lawyer hesitated. Most men would want credit for something like this, especially with a gift that size. Elvis leaned back, his gaze steady. "Credit don't heal a child. Just do it." By the end of the week, the hospital received an anonymous endowment large enough to fund entire wards, expand treatment programs, and secure doctors they had been begging for. Nurses cried openly when they heard the news. The administrators scrambled to thank whoever had been responsible, but no name was attached. The check came through a trust account, untraceable to its source. For Elvis, it brought a rare moment of peace. He played the piano that night with lighter hands, the chords flowing freer. It wasn't the whole million, not yet, but it was the beginning, the first step. But peace never lasted long in his world. Colonel Parker found out within days. He stormed into Elvis's suite, face flushed, his Panama hat clutched in one hand like a weapon. He slammed the newspaper onto the table, an article announcing the hospital's miraculous anonymous donation. "You think I wouldn't find out?" Parker barked, his accent thick with fury. "You gave it away." "Without me, without counsel, without control. Do you know what you've done?" Elvis remained calm, pouring himself a glass of water, the ice clinking gently. "I helped some folks who needed it. That's all." "That's all?" Parker's voice cracked. He pounded the table so hard the glasses rattled. "Do you understand the opportunity you just threw in the trash? We could have spun this. Headlines across the nation. Elvis Presley, the greatest philanthropist alive. You'd own the front page for weeks. Sponsors would line up. We'd sell more records, more tickets, more everything. Instead, you hide like a thief in the night. You robbed me of control." For once, Elvis's patience snapped. He set the glass down with a sharp click and stood, shoulders squared, eyes burning. "I ain't your business project, Colonel. I'm a man, and for once in my life, I chose something without you pulling the strings." The silence that followed was electric. The bodyguards outside froze at the sound of Elvis raising his voice, something almost unheard of in his dealings with Parker. The colonel sneered, his jaw working furiously. "Careful, son. Without me, you're nothing but a singer from Tupelo. I built this. Don't forget it." Elvis stepped closer, his voice steady, cutting through the tension like a blade. "You may have built the stage, but you don't own my soul." For the first time in years, Parker was left speechless. He spun on his heel, storming out of the suite, the door slamming hard enough to shake the frame. The room was still. Elvis leaned against the piano, breathing heavily, the adrenaline still burning in his veins. He had stood up to the Colonel before, in small ways, but never like this. Never so clearly. The line had been drawn. Later that night, as the desert lay quiet beyond the hotel windows, the phone rang. A voice on the other end, low and unrecognizable, spoke slowly. "I see you found the right road, but this is only the beginning." Elvis froze. "Who is this?" The line clicked dead. No answer. He set the receiver down carefully, his pulse racing. Was it the donor? Someone else? A game? He walked back to the piano, pressing a single key that hung in the air like a question. For the first time since the envelope appeared, he realized this mystery wasn't just about money. It was about faith, about courage, about how far he was willing to go when every force around him wanted to pull him back. The first step had been taken. There was no turning around now. The anonymous donation to the hospital was only the spark. Once Elvis took that step, the fire spread inside him. The check no longer felt like a burden tucked away in his Bible. It was becoming a tool, almost a compass pointing him forward. Quietly, almost in secret, he began directing more of the funds outward. A scholarship fund appeared at a small college in Mississippi. A struggling orphanage in Tennessee suddenly found its debts paid. A clinic in Las Vegas received state-of-the-art equipment it had begged for years to acquire. Every dollar moved in silence, passed through channels that erased his name. The world saw miracles of generosity, but no benefactor to praise. For Elvis, that was the point. Fame had always carried a spotlight, harsh and unrelenting, but for the first time he felt free moving in the shadows, knowing good was being done without applause. It was like singing a song no one heard, yet still knowing it reached the heavens. Whispers began to circulate. Reporters speculated about the mysterious patron-funding causes across the South. A few connected dots, noting how the timing matched Elvis's presence in those cities. Questions grew, but there was never proof. The Colonel, however, was not blind. His fury deepened with every rumor. He confronted Elvis in dressing rooms, backstage corridors, even in limousines, his voice rising with panic. "They'll figure it out," Parker snarled one evening after a sold-out show in Houston. "You can't throw money around like confetti and expect no one to talk. You're killing your brand, son. All this hush-hush charity, it don't sell records, it don't book concerts, it don't put you on television." Elvis didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at Parker, sweat still glistening from the performance, and said evenly, "Not everything's for sale, Colonel." The remark was small, but it struck like a hammer. Parker blustered, threatened to cancel upcoming appearances, muttered about tearing up contracts with film studios if Elvis kept going rogue. For decades, the Colonel had been the architect of his career, the man pulling every lever. Now the foundation was cracking. The tension bled into public view for the first time. During an interview with a national magazine, the journalist casually asked about the wave of anonymous gifts sweeping the region. Parker shifted uncomfortably in the corner, ready to jump in. But before he could, Elvis leaned forward, eyes steady. "I'll tell you this," he said, voice low but resolute. "A man's worth ain't counted by gold records or ticket stubs. It's in what's left behind when the music stops. If you can make somebody's road a little lighter, that's worth more than any Cadillac." The reporter blinked, stunned. This wasn't the rehearsed charm Parker usually fed the press. It was raw, unvarnished conviction. The Colonel's jaw worked furiously, but Elvis's words were already on tape. impossible to erase. When the article was published, fans reacted with awe. Letters poured in, praising his humility, his vision. Some begged to know how they could help. Others simply thanked him for speaking aloud what many believed, but few with his stature dared to say. Behind closed doors, Parker exploded. "You went off script! You gave the game away!" he shouted, pacing the hotel suite like a cornered animal. "You think people love saints? They love stars. You start talking like that, and you'll be forgotten before you know it." Elvis stood by the window, gazing out at the city lights. His reflection in the glass looked tired, but strangely lighter, as though the weight of secrecy was becoming a strength rather than a burden. He didn't even turn to face the colonel. "Maybe being forgotten don't scare me as much as never being real," he said softly. The words silenced the room. For the first time, the colonel realized his grip was slipping. Threats and contracts couldn't contain a man who no longer feared losing fame. In the weeks that followed, Elvis doubled down on his quiet mission. He visited schools after hours, meeting with principals who had no idea the donations flowing in came from the man standing humbly in their gymnasium. He walked through orphanages at night, speaking with children too young to know who he was, letting them laugh at his funny voices and songs without a hint of celebrity. Each act carried risk. Risk of discovery, risk of headlines, risk of the colonel tightening the leash. But with every smile, every thank you whispered in the dark, Elvis felt a kind of power no stage could give him. The million was dwindling, but its value grew with every dollar spent. It wasn't about the sum anymore. It was about transformation, his own as much as theirs. And deep inside, Elvis sensed something else, that the mysterious giver, whoever he was, hadn't chosen him by chance. The money was never meant to enrich him. It was meant to free him. For the first time in years, the king of rock and roll felt less like a prisoner of his crown and more like a man discovering his true purpose. It came late one evening when the tour bus had pulled into a quiet motel on the edge of a dusty highway in Texas. The others were asleep or gambling in the lobby. But Elvis stayed behind in his room, restless, unable to silence the constant hum of questions in his mind. The million was nearly gone now, much of it placed in hands that needed it more than his. Yet the mystery of its origin still gnawed at him. On the nightstand, beneath a Gideon Bible, another envelope waited. It had been slipped under the door without a sound. Elvis picked it up slowly, heart beating hard. By now he recognized the precise handwriting, the plain paper, the deliberate simplicity. He tore it open, half expecting another riddle. Instead, it contained a letter several pages long. The paper was thick, the ink pressed deep into its fibers, as though written with unusual care. At the top was a name Elvis had never spoken aloud, but had heard whispered in financial circles. A former oil magnate from Texas, a man once counted among the wealthiest in America before quietly retreating from public life. The words explained everything. The man had grown up poor in Oklahoma, abandoned by his father, saved from starvation by the kindness of strangers. He built his fortune in oil, lived extravagantly, and in the end, found the wealth hollow. In his last years, racked by illness, he decided to return what the world had given him. But he couldn't scatter his fortune aimlessly. He needed someone to carry his vision, someone who understood hunger, loneliness, and the ache of being overlooked. "I chose you," the letter read, "because beneath the rhinestones and headlines, I saw a boy who never forgot the sting of poverty. I saw a man who knew the cost of kindness. Money alone cannot outlive us, but deeds can. You will know what to do better than I ever could." Elvis set the page down, hands trembling. The man had already died. The letter was dated months before the first check appeared. This was no game, no scheme. It was the final will of a man who had seen in Elvis not just a star, but a kindred soul. Memories began flooding back. Faces in the audience he had half noticed over the years. A quiet figure in the corner of a casino showroom, sitting alone, never clapping too wildly, always watching. He had dismissed it as coincidence at the time, but now he realized the benefactor had been there, silently witnessing the music, silently measuring the man behind the crown. At the bottom of the final page were words that cut deeper than all the rest. I chose you not for the voice that shakes the world, but for the silence I saw in your eyes when the applause faded. You know what loneliness is, and you know how to heal it in others. That is why I trusted you. Elvis pressed the letter to his chest, leaning back in the chair, his breath shaky. For years he had wrestled with the meaning of his fame, whether it was gift or curse, blessing or prison. And now here was a man who had seen him more clearly than many of those closest to him. The colonel barged in moments later, smelling of whiskey and cigar smoke, ready to launch into another tirade about schedules. He spotted the letter in Elvis's hands and lunged for it, but Elvis pulled it back sharply. "Not this time," Elvis said firmly, his eyes blazing. "This ain't for you." Parker froze, unaccustomed to being denied. His voice grew sharp, but beneath it lay unease. "Who sent that? Who's pulling your strings, son? Don't you see? You're being used." Elvis shook his head. "No, Colonel. For once, I ain't the one being used. I'm the one finally being trusted." The colonel tried again, sputtering warnings about fraud, about danger, about reputations destroyed. But Elvis no longer heard him. His eyes remained fixed on the words of the letter, words that seemed to burn with truth. When Parker finally stormed out, slamming the door, Elvis sat in the silence once more. The night outside was still, the neon from the motel sign blinking through the blinds. He ran his fingers across the ink, lingering on the last line. You know how to heal it in others. For the first time in years, he felt tears on his cheeks. Not from exhaustion, not from frustration, but from recognition. Someone, somewhere, had seen him not as a product, not as an idol, but as a man carrying wounds of his own, and still capable of giving. The letter had revealed the secret. But more than that, it had revealed Elvis to himself. The letter never left his side. Folded carefully, it stayed in the inside pocket of his jacket, or tucked into the Bible on his nightstand. To anyone else, it was a few sheets of paper. To Elvis, it was both a compass and a verdict, proof that his fame had not blinded everyone to the man beneath the crown. In the months that followed, he moved with a new certainty. The million dwindled as he directed the last of it toward causes that mattered most. Funding a program for students who couldn't afford college, securing homes for families left destitute, covering medical costs for strangers who would never know who had saved them. He gave as though the money had never been his to begin with. And in truth, it never was. On stage, something shifted. The audiences still screamed, still surged toward him like waves against a cliff. But when he sang now, the music carried a weight deeper than showmanship. He wasn't just performing, he was speaking to them, sometimes pausing mid-song to let silence linger, as though reminding them that the man in white sequins was still flesh and soul. It was during one of those nights at the Hilton that it happened. Halfway through a ballad, Elvis stopped. The orchestra faltered. The drummer froze with sticks mid-air. The crowd hushed, confusion rippling through the massive room. Elvis stood there, gripping the microphone with both hands, his chest rising with heavy breaths. Finally, he spoke, voice low but carrying to every corner. You can take everything from a man, his money, his fame, even his voice. But if in his time he's made one child's life brighter, then he's lived for something that lasts. The silence held for a heartbeat. Then the room erupted, not with the wild hysteria of fans chasing an idol, but with something deeper. Applause thundered, mixed with shouts, tears, a storm of gratitude that felt more like church than concert. No one knew what exactly he meant, but everyone felt the truth in it. Backstage afterward, Parker was livid. He accused Elvis of destroying the show's polish, of confusing the audience, of undermining years of careful branding. Elvis listened quietly, then simply said, "Colonel, some things are bigger than the show." It was the last real argument they ever had. That night, in his dressing room, another envelope waited. Smaller this time, thinner, as if carrying only the faintest echo of the others. Elvis opened it with steady hands. Inside was a single sheet, blank except for a short line written in the familiar hand. You have fulfilled the condition. Now live free. No signature, no explanation. Just those words. He stared at them for a long while, the din of the casino seeping faintly through the walls. For once, there was no rush of questions, no storm of doubt. A quiet peace settled over him, as though a heavy curtain had finally lifted. Elvis sat at the upright piano in the corner, the envelope resting on the lid. He played slowly, softly, gospel chords first, then fragments of old country tunes, then something new altogether, a melody that seemed to belong only to that moment. His voice, roughened by years of strain, hummed gently along. No audience, no applause, no spotlight. Just him and the music. For the first time in many years, he smiled without effort. It wasn't the grin of a showman or the rehearsed charm of a star. It was quiet, unguarded, a smile born from the strange relief of finally knowing he had done something that mattered. The million was gone, but its echo, the lives changed, the futures saved, would outlive him. And for a man who had always been chased by the fear of fading, that realization was freedom itself. The music slowed, his hands resting gently on the keys. The room was still, filled only with the aftertaste of the final chord. And in that silence, Elvis Presley, the man behind the king, felt lighter than he had in years.